Are you a young person with lofty ambitions to change the world?
I shop at Whole Foods. What do you think?
Do you feel bummed out when you hear about poverty, climate change, and the other stuff?
Just heard about racism, bro? Not cool, man.
Do you lay awake at night for hours contemplating the existential anxiety that weighs upon your generation to solve a seemingly unsurmountable amount of systemic issues?
Yes.
Well, stick around, because for only one easy payment of about 15 minutes of attention, you'll be on your way to answering these problems in no time.
Now, I'm ready to save the world. One infographic at a time.
Alright, that was corny. Today I'm going to be talking about the book 21 Lessons for the 21st Century by Yuval Noah Harari. It's a really interesting book that gives an initial overview into some of the most important challenges that are going to face society in the next century. Reading this book didn't solve all of my problems, but it did help alleviate some of the anxieties that I talked about in that corny-ass intro. And so in this video I'm going to start off with a brief summary of the book. Then I'm going to share what my next steps were after reading this, like what I did with the information from the book. The author, Yuval Noah Harari, is a really fascinating historian and philosopher, and this book, 21 Lessons for the 21st Century, talks about some of his predictions for the next 100 years of what our biggest problems might be, based on his understanding of culture and history up until this point, and essentially what he thinks the most important problems and lessons are for the next century. And it has recommendations from all sorts of indie book reviewers, like this guy named Bill Gates, Joe Rogan, Mark Zuckerberg. If you want to be really brief, the book can be summarized in 3 sentences. The 3 most important problems of our time are going to be 1, the environmental crisis, 2, dealing with technological innovation, and 3, the potential of nuclear war. On a global level, the most important issues of our time are going to need a global and collaborative effort, and on a personal issue, the largest issues of our time are going to need a lot of self-exploration and deeply examining ourselves and our minds. But here are the 21 lessons. Part 1, the technical challenge. Lesson number 1, disillusionment. So Yuval essentially proposes that humanity is organized by a ton of people collectively agreeing upon these shared myths. Examples of stories would the communist story, the fascist story, or recently the liberal story has been the dominating story of society, which classifies humanity as a struggle between liberty and tyranny, and with the ideal being a decentralized world with peaceful collaboration amongst everybody. And that's the story that most countries agree upon, at least to an extent. But recently there's been a growing distrust in this story, with people seeing it as either undesirable or overly idealistic, which has led to a lot of feelings of impending doom and anxiety as the world lacks a clear alternative to it. Lesson number 2, work. Artificial intelligence could wipe a large amount of jobs, but if we have the right solutions and mitigations, that could actually be a blessing. Lesson number 3, liberty. Technological disruptions could reshape how we view democracy, free will, and ethics. There's so many interesting examples of this in the book, but one would be that self-driving cars require us to put computer code to very complex ethical dilemmas, which is super interesting. Part number 2, the political challenge. Lesson number 4, equality. Development in biotechnology could lead to unbridgeable genetic inequalities between classes, where, for example, rich countries would be able to pay for technologies to make them live longer, supplements to make them more creative and smarter, etc., which would mean they would be able to make even more money, and then countries who can't afford any of that are just left in the dust. Lesson number 5, community. People's sense of connection has been threatened as social polarization has increased and participation in meaningful communities has decreased. For example, less and less people are going to church. Lesson number 6, civilization. Humanity has merged into one large civilization whose identity will be defined by the global struggles that we all face in the coming century. All of the biggest problems of our time are things that are going to threaten everyone across the world equally, like the climate crisis, nuclear war, etc. Lesson number 7, nationalism. Nationalist leaders have grown in popularity recently with people like Boris Johnson, Trump, Brexit, and that's been in response to the lack of trust of the liberal narrative, like I talked about in lesson number 1. But nationalism isn't well equipped to deal with the biggest problems of our time because they'll require global collaboration between countries. Lesson number 8, religion. Religion will continue to play a key role in shaping our global identity in the coming century. Lesson number 9, immigration. Immigration is a complex issue that should be solved with reason and empathy based on the democratic process. Part 3, despair and hope. Lesson number 10, terrorism. Terrorism is not as big of a threat as people think, because it's a strategy almost exclusively used by small, weak powers, and it thrives off of very flashy but small attacks that are done in hopes of provoking an overreaction. And so the best solution is to remain calm and strategic. And so something that you wouldn't want to do, for example, would be to respond to one terrorist attack by destabilizing an entire region of the world for decades. Not that that has ever happened. Lesson 11, war. I forgot to film this one. But basically, an international war would be super irrational because it could kill everybody and there's not really a lot of economic upside anymore. But it still could happen because humans are really stupid and do dumb shit all the time. Lesson number 12, humility. No one culture is at the peak of humanity. Lesson number 13, God. People shouldn't use God as the sole justification for their morals. If you're religious, that's okay. It's just that you should exercise reason and empathy when interpreting like your holy texts. Lesson number 14, secularism. Secularism is defined by a strong commitment to finding the truth with the goal of reducing suffering. Part 4, truth. Lesson number 15, ignorance. Acknowledging your individual biases and ignorance is super important, especially because our brains are not wired to think critically. They're wired just to believe what the people around us believe. And so it's super important to reflect on what you're stupid about and just listen to people who know what they're talking about. And to learn deeply about an emerging subject, you need to have the privilege of wasting a lot of time researching and testing unproductive paths, etc. Lesson number 16, justice. Our sense of justice has not adapted well to how complex problems are today. And so the solution might be to empower communities to tackle problems together and to work together and all that nice stuff. Lesson number 17, post-truth. Fake news is not a new concept, but it's super prevalent today because of how hard it can be to tell if something's fake or not, and because it's very easy to be stuck in echo chambers where you're just surrounded, either in real life or on social media, by people who believe the same things as you. The solution is you have to seek out differing opinions and use critical thinking to evaluate for the truth. Lesson number 18, science fiction. A superhuman elite using advanced technology to rule the world is a more realistic threat than something like Terminator. And part 5, resilient. Lesson number 19, education. The new idea of education should focus on critical thinking, communication, collaboration, and creativity, as opposed to like memorization and the factory style learning that most of us are used to. Lesson number 20, meaning. Stories, like I talked about in lesson number 1, while fictional, can help give life meaning, as long as they 1, give you a role to play, and 2, embed you in something larger than yourself. And lesson 21, meditation. Meditation is a powerful tool for observing and uncovering basic patterns of your mind and examining yourself. Alternative forms of meditation can be therapy, art, sports, and anything where you get stuck in like a sense of flow. So that was a lot, but what's next? Now you know all of these problems, you know all these reasons why we might be fucked, but what do we do about it and where do we start? I don't have an exact answer to that, but this is what I did. So then I tried to take each chapter and turn it into a potential mission. So for example, for lesson number 1 about the story, the mission would be constructing a better story for humanity. What's next after liberal democracy? And I tried to do this for every chapter. It didn't exactly line up. Some of them didn't really have missions, or some of them overlapped a little bit. But eventually I ended up with a list of 20 potential missions or potential callings. And then I went in and deleted or crossed out the ones that I was either not personally interested in at all. Like for example, global identity, uniting global powers to get them to work together on the problems of our time would require like politics and international relations and shit like that. Like I'm just not gonna do that. So then I turned this list of 20 into a list of 11, which I then put into the super overly nerdy, scary looking spreadsheet that I have here. It's not as bad as it seems, and I'll put a link in the description if you want to use this framework for yourself. So I have my 11 issues from that last list here, and I have these 3 categories that I ranked each of those in: global importance, global urgency, and personal importance or personal connection. I started off with global importance, gave each problem a score from 1 to 10 on how important I think that issue was or what the stakes were. So like if this problem was not solved, what would happen? And so if I look at the filter of that in numerical order, nuclear war is the most important, so that has the highest stakes. I think that makes sense. If that problem isn't solved, then we're all fucking dead, no questions asked. And then there's a couple issues like education, for example, so communities, the global story, that I think connect to multiple problems, which is why I rank them high in importance. Anyways, I don't want to go through all of this because I'll be here all day. But that's what importance was, and these numbers were kind of guesses, kind of just estimations. Of these 11 problems, I could have read a ton of articles about all of them, cross-referenced them, and that might be worth doing once I narrow it down a bit, but I think I can get the general idea of what problems are most important just by like reading this book, like what I know about the issues already, and estimating from there. Anyways, Number 1, global importance. Number 2, global urgency. That is essentially what the time frame is, how important it is for us to start right now. So for example, nuclear war was super high in importance, but pretty low in urgency, just because I don't think we're gonna go into nuclear war tomorrow. So I don't really need to focus about that right now. But something like environment, I think is important that we get moving right now, so that's why I had it at the top of urgency. The last is kind of the least important, but also kind of the most important, and that is my personal connection to the issue. And so this is super subjective, just like what I'm interested in, what captures my curiosity. So then what I did is I normalized each of these scores. That's what these 3 columns are. Statistic shit, I don't know if I even did this right, but basically to help weigh each category a bit more evenly. And then I added each score together to have this super world-saving score for each problem, with the highest score being what this algorithm thinks is the most important problem for me, Jordan Mitchell, to solve right now, based off of my kind of subjective estimations and super subjective personal connection. And so I found that the 5 most important things for us to focus on right now or for me to focus on: 1, the environment; 2, connecting communities to problem solve together; 3, education; 4, the global story or global narrative; and 5, the ethics of artificial intelligence. And so that's where I'm at now. I think the next step is to kind of reflect a bit more qualitatively and not just look at it as numbers. But I think education and environment, I think there's actual possibility for me to deliver impact in those areas. So those are the 2 things I'm probably going to look at next. That's kind of my thought process of how I'm thinking about this. I think my next step now, looking for more drilled down problems to solve within environment and education, and maybe ethics. But that's just me. Like I said, I put all these resources in the description, from the super in-depth summary of the book, the list of potential missions, and the link to the spreadsheet if you want to play around and fuck with the numbers and add in your own categories. If you do this yourself, only change these 3 numbers. Oh, and here's some more videos here. I want to break down a book that I'm reading right now by Bill Gates about the climate crisis and like, I don't know, here's a playlist of other videos. Fucking some self-promo is here. You should click on it. Okay.